So let's talk about the new and brutal Ork cavalry units likely charging onto a table near you in the not too distant future. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're taking another look at the Squighog Boyz, the new snagga cavalry unit, which was introduced in the new Codex Orks. Today we'll be taking a look over their datasheet, running some numbers on their damage output, any buffs and synergies we can use with them, and a few thoughts as to how they'll fit into Orky lists. I must say, out of the new snagga models, I think that these guys are probably my favourite. They're basically the spiritual successor of the old Ork Boys, which you could get back in 3rd and 4th edition. Nicely reimagined, and maybe feeling a bit more 40k than their previous versions were. They're annoyingly only available in that out-of-print snagga box at the moment, but I'm sure it won't be too long before Games Workshop releases them as a solo kit, hopefully in the near future, alongside the Ork Codex. So let's start out by having a look at their datasheet then. The Squighog Boyz are a fast attack choice for Codex Orks. They're 25 points per model, and you can get them in squads of 3 to 6. The individual models are cavalry. They have the snagga keyword for that 6+ invul, and their +1 to hit against vehicles and monsters. They do have the squig keyword, and they are a core unit. The boys have a movement of 10 inches, weapon skill of 3+, ballistic skill of 5+, strength 5, toughness 6, 3 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 6, and a 4+ save. Generally that's a fairly resilient stat line. Most small arms are going to be wounding them on 5s. For 25 points, I describe their defensive stat line as not particularly bad, but maybe just a little bit unhelpful, as unless you're targeting them with strength 3 weapons, near enough anything will do some pretty decent damage to these, whether it's anti-tank or anti-infantry. It just maybe makes your opponent's decision making a little bit easier, as unless you're strength 3, most things can be fairly efficient targeting them. Their attack and damage profile is really quite impressive, as we'll get onto in just a second. 10-inch movement should have them pressurizing the opponent nice and early, though perhaps their Achilles heel is their very low leadership of 6, which does give you really quite a high chance of losing further models if you do take a casualty or 2, never mind if your opponent has any sort of leadership debuffs. For their weapons, they do have a little bit of shooting. Their rocket-propelled sticker spear has a 12-inch assault 1 profile at strength 5 -2 damage 2. Not bad, but you're rarely going to do all that much that's meaningful with them. Even on a big 6 model unit, you're only averaging 2 hits. And the saddle gits also get to shoot with one of their gun weapons, which has an 8-inch range, assault 1, strength 4 and AP 0. I guess it's quite nice that you'd always be able to crack off a shot or 2 with them, but sometimes you might not even want to, just for fear of making your charge even longer. Really though, these guys are all about the melee, and their melee damage is impressive to say the least. We'll get onto their damage output in a second, but they get 3 attacks with that sticker, at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. Pretty ideal for killing Primaris Marines, and not bad against most things. The Squighog makes a couple of extra 2 attacks with its jaws, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2 there. And the saddle git grots also get an extra 1 attack at strength 3, AP -1 and damage 1. Overall, 5 quality combat attacks coming out of these is really not bad for 25 points. The only option that the unit can take is whether or not to take a bomb squig for an extra 5 points, and I think it's a pretty reasonable upgrade on this, as well as quite a fun model with a grot with a nail on a motorized squig. In the new Codex, you let them off in the shooting phase. On a 3+, one enemy unit within 12 inches takes D3 mortal wounds, and for the 5 points I think that's generally very worth it. These guys are usually going to want to be getting right up close to the enemy, so I think you'll be able to use them more games than not. Overall, they're a reasonably fast-moving core cavalry unit, generally quite tough, but most firepower will be effective against them, a tiny bit of shooting, and a lot of melee for the cost. Talking about that melee, let's take a look at the sort of numbers that these guys can throw out. This is the damage output for just a 3 model unit for 75 points, and I think that the numbers kind of speak for themselves. If you have no damage buffs whatsoever and they just charge in, you'd kill around about 9 guardsmen on the charge, 4 Space Marine intercessors, or do around 5 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. That is including their +1 to hit from being snaggers. Really not bad considering you get a tiny bit of shooting on top of that. Against the right targets, they're really quite likely to make back their points investment in a single charge. However, of course we can do quite a lot better than that. Say if we took them in the Snakebites clan, with their +1 to wound on the charge for any squig units, we happen to be in one of the 2 turns that you'll get +1 attack from the War, and you also manage to coordinate a beast boss within 6 inches, that would give them a +1 to hit against everything. Then you look like you're killing around about 13 guardsmen, a massive 8 Space Marine intercessors, wounding them on a 2+ unless they play transhuman or anything, or around about 9 or 10 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, giving you a reasonable chance of one-shotting most light tanks. If you can deliver a supported unit into close combat, then it's really quite a crazy potential damage output for such a little investment. We just mentioned a few, but being a core unit there really are quite a lot of options for getting more out of them and using extra buffs on the unit. They definitely prefer being in a war army rather than a speed war one. They'll be able to advance and charge and also have +1 attack on the charge, definitely making them into a far more dangerous unit. Clan-wise, my favourites just for raw damage output are Snakebites and Goths. The Snakebites, as we mentioned, get +1 to wound, and they can only be wounded on a 4+ for toughness 7, and could potentially pair with their unique beast snagga boss, Mosrog Scragbad. The Goths in general won't do quite as much damage as the Snakebites on the charge. They get their exploding 6s in melee and +1 strength on the charge. It means they'll generally be a little bit better than Snakebites against toughness 6 or 7 targets, but a bit worse against the rest. They'll be a bit better in protracted combats though, as they'll still keep that exploding 6s even if they're not charging in. Otherwise, Evil Sons are quite interesting. They get the extra move and can also pair well with their relic Resmecha's redder armor. You could maybe give that to a beast boss and make enemy units nearby fight last. And blood axes do seem just generally fairly useful for them, getting light cover at long range. They'll like to redeploy to either be super threatening if you go first or super hidey if you go second, and being able to fall back and charge again is pretty handy for these as they charge through the enemy ranks. Finally, if you may be running a bit more of a ranged army, you could potentially make them the specialist mob of being Mad Boys, a bit random and maybe slightly weak melee buffs, but if you weren't using the specialist mob for anything else and you didn't need them to work in synergy with things, then I guess it could be a choice. As their core units, they can work with quite a lot of characters too. Probably the most obvious pairing is the Beast Boss or Mosrog Scragbad. It will give them a +1 to hit, they can keep up with them, and also charge into melee alongside them, dealing a whole ton of damage in their own right. You might just want to take a fighty warlord trait on them, though I suppose if they are supporting a lot of Squighogs, you could potentially take the Beast Gob warlord trait. That would make the Squig jaw attacks that they get 2 of each, and make them +1 damage, so they could potentially munch something like a Gravis Marine on every wound you get through. Otherwise, you could potentially try and run a Pain Boss alongside. They can give them some feel no pain and heal a few wounds. The knob on Smasher Squig can be included slot free with them, though I think it's a bit disappointing he can't give them any sort of morale synergy. I would have hoped that he might at least be able to raise them to leadership 7 for being nearby, but it seems not, though I guess he could be a fairly cheap and fairly threatening character to run alongside as well, with his big mortal wound impact hits damage. Weird Boys actually work surprisingly well with them as well. You could potentially give them the extra attack and also use Dad Jump across the battlefield, which does seem to work on any core unit. That might be better placed on slower units like Boys though, as these guys already have pretty decent movement in their own right and will make combat a bit more reliably unsupported. If you're running a Whir Boy or a Kill Rig, you have another option for upping their amount of jaw attacks. This will mean that the Squig jaws get +1 attack each, and they'll do mortal wounds on any roll of a 6 to wound as well. Theoretically, you could go very heavy on the Squig strategy, maybe run that alongside Beast Gob, and then in addition to the 3 sticker attacks, you'll also be getting 3 Squig jaw attacks at damage 3, and also 6s cause mortal wounds with those. I don't think I'd actually buy in a Whir Boy for that express purpose, to be honest. More likely something I might include opportunistically on a Kill Rig if there is one advancing alongside these boys. Finally, if you can get any mobs nearby with greater than half strength, that will certainly help with the leadership tests that they might likely fail. Being able to not take the -1 to combat attrition could be the difference between the last guy running and not. Stratagems wise, for some reason I haven't managed to put the single most important one on the list, but that would be Tough as Squig Hide for 2 CP, which is basically transhuman physiology on the unit. Whenever your opponent makes a wound attack against them, a 1 to 3 always fails, irrespective of any other abilities. If they're about to be shot by an absolute ton of heavy firepower, that could be well worth the investment, and it's certainly good for other things as well, such as maybe Blood Angels with a pesky +1 to wound, or other mechanics that wound you on a 2+ automatically, like some poison weapons. Always nice to have a bit of pop-up extra survivability. Otherwise, if you're not Snakebites, you could think about Monster Hunters for 2 CP. That's +1 to wound 1 monster or vehicle units for 2 CP, and you could use it to affect up to 3 units of these guys, or 2 units and a beast boss if you wanted. That could be pretty scary in combination with Goths. You could have them wounding toughness 7 vehicles on a 3+ with their stickers and their jaw attacks. Otherwise, there's Tide of Muscle for 1 command point to ignore charge roll modifiers, Breaking Heads if you're near a war boss or beast boss, that will auto pass your low leadership at the expense of D3 mortal wounds, Sometimes that's going to be worth it, but a bit annoying as you both pay the CP and also have the chance of removing one of your own models if you roll badly. And you could think about using a teleporter or strategic reserve if you did want to basically guarantee having the chance of a charge at the enemy. These guys are fairly fast moving and can generally make their presence felt without that, but at the same time maybe a couple of cheap units thrown into strategic reserve for 1 CP, they could present themselves quite an annoying threat turning up on the flanks. Out of all these, I'd ideally want to be using them in an army with War, likely either Snakebites or Goths, either maybe in just small unsupported units, or maybe if I was running a couple of big units of 5, stick them alongside a beast boss, potentially have a kill rig advancing alongside them, and think about the 2 CP stratagem for transhuman physiology or the extra wounds against vehicles. So that's roughly how I think about fielding them in game. 3 model independent units for flanking, moving fast, and bullying other enemy objective scoring squads. They should be really quite efficient at removing any sort of chaff infantry, and fairly tough to their return attacks. I could definitely see a big unit or 2 of these being some of your core advance up the board though. As I said, maybe alongside a beast boss or a kill rig. Compared with the Orky infantry units, maybe you need to think a little bit more about terrain and movement lanes. As cavalry, they're not going to be able to move straight through ruins like infantry, so I think you want a plan for how they're going to get to their targets, so you're not just denied an all-important charge by an annoying bit of ruin or something. It's quite nice that they're basically encouraged to advance every single turn that they're not charging. It's not going to limit their shooting or anything, so they should be surging towards the enemy pretty quickly and putting some pressure on them to be dealt with. I think they're really quite a powerful unit to use with War. You could potentially be making some very, very long charges with them. I think they'd average something like a 21-inch threat range with the Ork Here We Go rule, in addition to advance and charge and their regular movement. For weaknesses, I'd say their main one is maybe just being shot straight down. As I said, their durability is pretty good, but I don't think that you could reliably say that any one unit of them would weather the opponent's shooting phase. They'll be particularly quite vulnerable to things like autocannons, and with 25 points and being fairly low save, both anti-infantry and anti-tank will be at least fairly effective against them. That low leadership is going to be annoying as well. It's going to be painful to have the risk of saying goodbye to even more of these whenever you take casualties. Overall though, I think that they seem like a really strong unit, and I'm sure we'll see a fair amount of them appearing in strong Ork lists. Their melee damage output is absolutely great, they're pretty fast for getting there, and they can be another Orky threat just to charge straight up the board and try and overload your opponent with multiple pressing threats. For the slots, maybe they're competing against Warbikers and Storm Boys. Warbikers still do a reasonable amount of damage on the charge, but a lot more anti-infantry focused, and of course they spew out an enormous amount of dagger gun shots before they get into combat. Far more of an anti-infantry and a more hybrid unit. Storm Boys again will move pretty fast, and again will be more anti-infantry in nature, with a large amount of strength 4 attacks at AP-1, as opposed to the more generalist multi-damage profile on the Squighogs. Maybe for raw damage they might struggle against Boys or Mega Knobs. Them setting up with a jump near the enemy for a charge could be a good option. Maybe at some point we might have to do a bit of math hammer for melee damage output of a few Ork units. Could be a fun one to take a look at. So let me know what you think of the Squighogs then. They do seem really quite strong to me, and I'm sure they'll be pretty popular in Ork armies that go down a bit of a beast snagga theme. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly have plenty more Orky videos coming out in the future. I'm looking forward to going over a few other units and options out of the new decks. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolute massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.